Thanks so much for coming to the second in the series of 3 lectures by distinguished guests on the topic of Israel's quest for peace, past, present, and future. My name is Stefan Schmidt, and I'll be moderating tonight's program. And here's what we're going to do. I'll introduce the speaker. Our guest will deliver her address. After the lecture, we'll have a period for questions and answers and comments. And I would ask you to keep your questions or comments short, because given the size of the audience tonight, I'm sure lots of people would like an opportunity to become involved in the discussion. And after the formal program, we're going to have refreshments in this side of the room and book signings in that side of the room. And we hope that you will enjoy the program. As you know, this series was made possible by a number of sponsors, including the Jewish Community Relations Council, the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines, the Ames Coalition for Peace, and through Iowa State University's Hillel Miller Endowment, which was established through the generosity of the late F. Wendell Miller, the Committee on Lectures, and the Institute on World Affairs, which is funded by the government of the student body. The speaker tonight, for many of you, doesn't really need an introduction, but I will give one anyway because I think she's an extraordinarily qualified and interesting person. I'm sure you've seen her, if not on media, heard her on public radio, then perhaps you've seen the movie that was made, which was largely scripted apparently around some of her work in the federal government. Dr. Stern, Dr. Jessica Stern, is a lecturer in public policy and a faculty affiliate of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. From 1994 to 95, she served as director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council, where she was responsible for national security policy towards Russia and the former Soviet states, and for policies to reduce the threat of nuclear smuggling and terrorism. Obviously, given the years 1994 to 95, you know whose administration that was in. Stern earlier worked at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. In 1998-99, she was not just the terrorism fellow, but the super terrorism fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, probably the country's most important and influential foreign policy body. 1995 to 96, she was a national fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. She's the author of a number of books. I think we have 2 of them here, The Ultimate Terrorist and the other book, which I will mention in 1 second, and obviously also lots of articles on terrorism and on weapons of mass destruction. She received her bachelor's degree from Barnard College in chemistry and a Master of Science from MIT and a doctorate in public policy from Harvard. Dr. Stern's presentation tonight is titled Terror in the Name of God, Why Religious Militants Kill, and that, of course, is the title of this book. This book was designated as one of the notable books of 2003 by the New York Times. And I would ask you to help me welcome Dr. Stern to Iowa State University.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I've never been to Iowa before, and I'm having a great time. I want to start by telling you about the project that culminated in the book Terror in the Name of God. I had been researching a book on the prospect for terrorists to use weapons of mass destruction, the other book, The Ultimate Terrorist, that's also here apparently. And that was a book that I was very well trained to write. It was about weapons of mass destruction, which I had been working on professionally throughout my career. And it occurred to me as I was finishing that book that some of the individuals that had attempted to acquire or actually acquired chemical or biological weapons were living in the United States, and that I might be able to contact them. And this is not something that is the norm for scholars to think about phoning terrorists. And I have to tell you that I was really frightened. The first phone call I made, I called the local police and I called the neighbors even before telephoning William Pierce, who's the late leader of the National Alliance, which is a neo-Nazi organization. And soon after that, I had an interview with someone that really was kind of a life-changing experience. It was someone who had been second in command of an identity Christian cult. That's a white supremacist neo-Nazi cult. And this group had acquired a large drum of cyanide with the aim of killing large numbers of people in major cities with the goal of persuading the Messiah to return more quickly. And he seemed to me not only to be deeply religious, but also deeply spiritual. And I was very confused because I had an idea that those things, being very religious and very spiritual, made people better human beings, not that it wasn't going to turn them into doing things that, in my view, were quite evil. And also, I must say, he seemed a bit Meshuggah. So I decided that, not being an authority on Meshuggah, when I went to see him in Texas, that I would bring a psychologist with me. And I brought Dr. Stephen Cull, whose work you may know. He's actually a pollster. He has been studying the views of the American public on foreign affairs for many years, but he has a side specialty, which is helping people overcome difficult mystical experiences. So I thought he'd be the right guy to bring with me. And he told me that this man was not mentally ill, despite having thought that killing large numbers of people would change the timetable of the Messiah's return, that it was an organizational phenomenon, and that inside a group, the group itself begins to lose its connection with what most of us think of as reality. And the individuals within it are able to, because they believe in something, overcome the strictures of the Judeo-Christian just war tradition, and when it comes to the Muslims who do the same thing, also the Islamic just war tradition, and essentially also doing what their mothers taught them was wrong. They start to really believe this, and they kind of slip over the moral edge, certainly as far as most of us are concerned. From Texas, I went to Pakistan quite a few times. I got to know the Pakistani jihadi groups quite well. And these are groups that, many of them are members of bin Laden's International Islamic Front. And I went to Beirut. I talked to Hezbollah. I met with Sheikh Fadlallah. I don't actually cover Hezbollah in my book because most of the people I met with were parliamentarians. Hezbollah is the clean political machine in Lebanon. Americans think of it as a terrorist organization, and it has a terrorist organization, but in Lebanon it's mostly a clean political force, greatly admired not only by Shia but also by Sunnis and Christians. I went to Gaza, where I met with Abu Shanab, who was killed by the Israeli government about a month ago, several months ago. And I also met with Dr. Rantisi, the pediatrician who served as the leader of Hamas for a very brief period until he also was killed recently. I went to Israel and talked to Jewish terrorists, some of them retired. I actually met with the man who organized the group that said the Aramaic prayer that would purportedly lead to the death of Rabin. And this man, who is a mystic and a criminal, really claimed to believe that prayer had resulted in the murder of Rabin. I went to Indonesia. This was in the summer of 2001. And when I came back from these trips, especially to Pakistan and Indonesia, I found that my colleagues, area specialists, were quite skeptical. When I came back from Pakistan, the view of people who really know Pakistan well was that I had really, obviously, I looked at the world with a particular lens, and that woman, wherever she looks, she's going to see a terrorist. And similarly, when I came back from Indonesia, I got the same kind of reception. And of course, Indonesia specialists and specialists on Pakistan no longer think that this was an aberration, that I was just looking at the world in a particular way. So I want to talk to you about four levels of vulnerabilities or risk factors that I've identified as a result of my studies, talking to terrorists, and also my reading of other people's work. And those four levels are the global level, the national level, the level of the individual, and if there's time, I'll talk about what happens at the level of the organization. At the global level, it won't surprise you to hear that a major vulnerability leading to the spread of terrorism is the internet. And terrorists are very aware of this vulnerability. I will tell you about one man who made it into my book, even though he doesn't kill in the name of God. He is a very good example of a lone wolf avenger, an individual who, on his own, decided to take down the government, the U.S. government in this case. And I felt I had an excuse to put him in the book. He's a very interesting man, even though he's not a religious terrorist. He is basically at the cutting edge of this kind of lone wolf terrorism. And he's an MIT-trained chemist who started out his career as a chemist by coming up with a way to make designer drugs in such a way that it was not illegal. He wasn't using illegal inputs, in any controlled inputs, and he managed to come up with drugs that were apparently quite effective, but skirting around the law. And he started a company that didn't do very well, and he owed the IRS a lot of back taxes, and he didn't want to pay. And he got angrier and angrier at the IRS, and he started going after them with stink bombs. And the IRS didn't really like this. In addition to that, he came up with an internet scheme called assassination politics that would enable individuals to donate digital cash to those who correctly predict the death of what he called a slime ball or miscreant. He was out to rid the world of slime balls and miscreants, and slime balls and miscreants are government officials, especially IRS agents. And the IRS felt that this scheme could have worked, and they were very troubled by his activities and went to search his residence and found that he had been experimenting with chemical and biological weapons, and indeed had an immediate precursor to a nerve agent, and apparently had gotten pretty far in his experimenting, although whatever it was he was doing, some of it is not in the public record, and I wasn't able to get access to it. But the government says that he had gone farther, and I have, in this particular case, no reason to doubt the government, having spent a lot of time on the telephone with this gentleman. He understands the importance of the internet. He used the internet to come up with this scheme, assassination, to spread his plan, to recruit, in a way, for his plan to rid the world of slime balls and miscreants. But he also talks about how the internet makes it possible for individuals to take down a government. So he understands, in a theoretical sense, how important it is. At the national level, some of the at the level of states, some of the risk factors that have been identified, not by myself, but by other scholars, include the natural resource curse. States that are cursed with a single natural resource, such as oil, seem to have trouble with their economies over the long term, but for some reason also have trouble establishing a functioning democracy. There's a correlation. It's not, I don't think anybody's suggesting causality, but there's definitely a correlation that can be observed. Low GDP per capita seems to be a major risk factor. It's for violence. It is considered to be a very good proxy for weak states. This is work by James Fearon and David Layton. They're both professors at Stanford, and I like their work very much. But I have to admit that when I went around talking to terrorists, I noticed that terrorists thrive in failed states. Now, low GDP per capita is also a proxy for poverty, and yet these two scholars aren't prepared to say that poverty in itself is a cause of internal war or terrorism. And I think I'll just address that issue directly, since it's such a hot issue. I don't think that there's any evidence that poverty causes terrorism, and some of you may have seen the work of Alan Kruger, an economist at Princeton, who he has purportedly shown that poverty and lack of education are not correlated with terrorism. In fact, he believes just the opposite. But I think he has very selective data, so I don't buy his argument. He looks, those of you who are interested, I'll tell you exactly my complaint about his data. It's very narrow. I won't go into details here. But the general hypothesis that poverty isn't a cause of terrorism on its own seems to me to be fairly likely to be right, given that there are so many poor countries around the world that don't produce terrorists. And we would, I believe, see a lot more terrorism in poor countries if it were directly related. However, I have seen the way terrorist leaders take advantage of the poor, and I'll talk about that a bit more. They use the poor as cannon fodder. They take advantage of those who can't find other kinds of jobs. Maltreatment of women, interestingly, seems to be a risk factor for trouble establishing a functioning democracy, as well as for violence. Maltreatment of women also is an indicator of possible problems with an unnatural ratio of males to females, which is a very important indicator for possible violence. Even the CIA is now putting it on. If you look at the CIA's website, you'll see that high ratio of males to females. It's put up on country profiles because it is now taken so seriously as a risk factor for violence. So those are some of the issues that seem to be problems at the level of the nation state when we look at sort of the macro level. Of course, festering interstate conflicts is another one that I failed to mention. It's at the individual level that I've had the most interesting results, going around the world just asking terrorists why they do what they do. And as I said, I got curious not only why they do, what makes them join these organizations and what makes them stay, but also what happens within the organization to create that kind of group pathology that Dr. Steve Cull felt was going on in regard to that identity Christian cult that he visited with me. I think there are three kinds of benefits that terrorist groups offer their members. The first is, and I'm going to speak a little bit in the language of collective action. I know I see there are a lot of students in the room, and so I'll just say briefly that you can think of terrorism as a collective action problem. That terrorists claim to be promoting a public good. And just as Mansur Olson talked about selective incentives to get people to contribute to other kinds of collective action, I think that's exactly what goes on in terrorist groups, only it's not just the kind of material incentives that Mansur Olson talked about. So here are the kind of basket of goods that I think these groups offer. At the moral or spiritual level, there is the excitement of feeling that one is contributing to an important and good cause. And it doesn't mean that that cause is sort of organic, that the terrorists are always representing something that the population demands. Terrorism often starts out because there is a grievance that most of us would find perfectly understandable, if not perfectly legitimate. But over time, the grievance will shift. It becomes a marketing strategy, and that's something very important to bear in mind. But as we look at, for example, how the organization Al-Qaeda is evolving, it started out with the mission of defeating Soviet forces in Afghanistan. The group that became Al-Qaeda had that mission. Al-Qaeda then claimed credit not only for defeating the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, but destroying a superpower. So, as did the Pakistani jihadi groups that participated in that war. But Al-Qaeda then switched its mission. When Saddam attacked Kuwait, bin Laden offered his services to King Fahd, saying that he would like to defend Saudi Arabia from Saddam. And he was rebuffed. And he found a new mission, which was forcing U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia. Now, U.S. troops are leaving Saudi Arabia. So Al-Qaeda has actually accomplished its second mission. But as it goes along, the group keeps changing its mission. It's more or less the march of dimes of terrorist organizations. Once it accomplishes one mission, it finds a new mission. So I believe that we should be skeptical of terrorist groups that become professional over time. They will find new missions, and we should be skeptical that the individuals involved in the terrorist organization are exclusively motivated by a grievance. By thinking of terrorism in that way, I think we romanticize it, and we also won't be able to fight it because it's just wrong. The second basket of goods that terrorist groups offer their followers are emotional rewards. Individuals often come into these groups through social networks, pre-existing social networks. It's not that surprising. These are often secret societies. And if you think about what you would do if you were running a secret society under risk, you'd want to make sure that those you recruit into the organization were people that you could trust. And even if they don't come in through pre-existing social networks, very quickly they become very attached to their comrades, and leaders are quite aware of this, just as military leaders are, by the way, that when faced with violence, individuals are deeply concerned about protecting their comrades, and they often forget about that grievance that they're fighting to redress during those periods. The most important thing that I feel that terrorist groups offer followers on an emotional level is a new collective identity. And this is one of the variables that I have seen in every group that I've studied. And I've looked at, I've mentioned, I've looked at Islamist groups, I've looked at Jewish groups, I've looked at Christian groups, I've also looked at Hindu groups, although I don't write about them. And I know something about the Buddhist groups operating in Sri Lanka, although I've never interviewed them. Every religion is susceptible to this. Every single operative that I've ever talked to has talked about humiliation in one way or another, and how the group, even if he doesn't use that word, how the group offers a new identity with honor or dignity. And I want to give you a couple of examples. The man who was second in command of that identity Christian cult told me that he was very sickly as a child, and he was forced to take the girls' gym class. And that the first time he felt strong was when he was surrounded by a group of armed men living on an armed compound. The founder and leader of the Muslim Jambaz Force, a group in Kashmir, his name is Firdous Syed, told me that he started that group not because he was concerned about, had nationalist feelings about Kashmir. This is quite interesting because we usually think of indigenous Kashmiri groups as being more nationalist than religious. But he told me that he was motivated by what he heard in a Jamaat Islami mosque. Jamaat Islami is, by its own description, a fundamentalist approach. It's a fundamentalist organization. They call themselves fundamentalists. And what he heard was that the Islamic world had been humiliated by the Western world, and indeed that the West was deliberately out to humiliate the Islamic world, and that the way to overcome that feeling of humiliation was by participating in a so-called jihad. And what he did was participate in a jihad against India in Kashmir. These groups are now very closely aligned with Al-Qaeda, as I said. They're now participating in a jihad against the West. This is very important to understand, because it means that when we think about how to fight terrorism, we have to bear this sense of humiliation in mind, and how our enemies are going to use our actions to strengthen that feeling of humiliation in their among their followers. There are also very important material incentives that these groups offer. So groups that function in poor countries, payments are very important. And this was a very big surprise to me. I discovered that for mid-level managers, not for the cannon fodder, but for mid-level managers, terrorism is really a high-paying job. And in fact, I met some who said they would really like to quit, but they couldn't afford to quit. Indeed, I met one man whom I describe in the book, who wanted not only to quit his organization, but to defect to the United States. And I was very alarmed when he came to tell me this, because I knew when I was doing this research in Pakistan that I was only doing it because Pakistan's intelligence agency was allowing me to do it, that I was not going to get anywhere. I was not going to see anything that they didn't want me to see. And so I really thought this might have been some kind of setup that could be dangerous, well, for me and also for him. I really didn't know what was going on, and so it was a very difficult moral decision, but I decided the right response was to tell him, great, quit your group and not do anything with that information. And he, interestingly, did quit, and had an idea, I don't know where he got this idea, that he would be able to support himself very well if he sold a book. And I told him that on my book, The Ultimate Terrorist, I thought that I had earned significantly less than minimum wage writing it, but he was not going to be moved. He's still living. Most of his friends thought that once he started writing about his experiences, he would be killed pretty quickly. He wasn't able to earn the money that he hoped he would, and didn't sell the stories he had hoped to sell. But I can tell you why he wanted to quit, and that is that he discovered that the leaders that persuaded him to join this organization were not in it because they were worried about the Kashmiri people. They were in it because they were making a lot of money. And I learned about this also through my own interviews. I interviewed the leader of the organization he worked for, and this man had obviously been briefed in advance of my visit, or it seemed to me quite likely he had been instructed about what to say. And the interview was really, it was really a waste of my time, because he was lying and lying, and I told him I knew he was lying, and I told him I'd like to include him in a database, but I couldn't do so if he was going to continue lying. Well, anyway, at one point he said to me, I am ready to go back to the battlefield at any time. I was meeting with him in the capital city, in Islamabad, in a very horrible-looking office with a burnt-out Jeep in the back, in a kind of foyer, open foyer, very distressing. But even though it was a very distressing environment that he was showing me, I didn't believe him. I thought that that was yet another lie, like the other ones he was telling me about how there was no training of mujahideen in Afghanistan, even though by that time those camps had been identified publicly in satellite photographs. and that there was no training, and that there was no training in Pakistan, and none in Afghanistan, and none of the Pakistani jihadis were going into Afghanistan, and there was no involvement of the Pakistani government in the so-called jihad in Kashmir. But anyway, I felt he was lying, and I just had this flash of insight that maybe he didn't want to go back to the battlefield because he was in love. I can't explain to you why it came into my mind, but it did. And I asked him, "Are you married?" And sure enough, he said he had just gotten married. He had just got married for the second time. He farmed the first wife out to his parents' house. And his new wife was living right around the corner. And so I asked in their house, and I asked if I could meet her. And he said, yes, I could. I think he was so taken aback by that question that he said yes. So I went with him, and I saw that he was living in a gigantic mansion. Everything was absolutely pristine. When I was meeting with him in his office, I was actually afraid to drink the tea, even though the water is boiled. You can't drink water that isn't boiled in South Asia if you're an American because your stomach's too weak. Or I don't know, the immunologist can tell us why not. But it's not a good idea. I was afraid to drink the tea. And yet when I got to his house, I was offered Coca-Cola in closed bottles, obviously had been on ice. There were maids scurrying about. He had a beautiful young wife who was from Saudi Arabia, where he went on fundraising missions. She spoke perfect English. This was just a very good example of what I think this young man had figured out about how these groups operate. And it's not that every leader lives that way, not at all. Just as there are many kinds of incentives that I've outlined for you that the groups offer followers, also leaders are different. Some are interested in the purported spiritual rewards, the satisfaction of contributing to what they feel is a good cause, perhaps the 72 virgins, if they are promoting, they may see that as a spiritual incentive. Some are interested in the satisfaction, emotional satisfaction of being a leader, or are very vain. They're interested in the glamour. And I believe that for bin Laden, that has become a very, very important incentive, that sense that he's a glamorous and important personage. Also, the material rewards are important to consider when we look at what happens in the madrasas and Pazantran. The extremist madrasas, most madrasas are like the equivalent of Catholic schools in the United States. They're just religious schools, but some of them function as factories of jihad. And what happens is, in very poor rural areas, often parents can't afford the very minor fees for bus fare and books. And they end up sending their children to these schools where they get free housing and free food, and much more than just memorizing the Quran. But they don't get much of an education at these extremist schools. They're encouraged during their summer vacations to be mujahid interns, essentially. On one of the visits to an extremist madrasas that I took, the chancellor, who was an extremely charismatic man, allowed me to talk to any of the students. He went with me, and I could talk to any of them. And I asked all of the young men I met with, what would you like to do when you grow up? And every single one, with the exception of two of them, said they wanted to be mujahideen. I asked them, how do you feel about America? Down with America, they said. I asked them, why do you say down with America? They'd say, well, everybody says that. They don't know why they feel anti-American, but it's just something that they're getting from this charismatic leader and from their friends. They're really being taught hate in these schools. Two young men did not want to be mujahideen. One said he wanted to be a doctor, and I saw a look of embarrassment on the chancellor's face, and I was really puzzled because I would have thought he would have been embarrassed that every single one of his kids said he wanted to be a mujahid. In other words, he wanted to be cannon fodder in a losing battle against the Indians. No, he was embarrassed because there were a couple of students who hadn't decided they wanted to be mujahideen yet. and he told me they just arrived. Eventually they will also want to be mujahideen. So those are the three kinds of, the sort of basket of incentives that I think terrorist groups offer their followers. Now let me just say a little bit about two kinds of organizations. I see two ideal types of organizations. One is a terrorist army, which is a commander cadre organization where the leader is offering salaries, the leader is offering training. The leader, it's likely to involve specialized functions. It will have a internal travel agency. It's likely to have public relations officers. Indeed, I've met many terrorist public relations officers. It's likely to have people who specialize in meeting with major industrialists, doing fundraising with charities, and so on. At the other extreme is the virtual network, what American white supremacist identity Christians call leaderless resistance, where the leader does not offer training, does not pay operatives. He just inspires individuals to begin their own cells. And you see this kind of operation in a place like the United States, where it's a very law enforcement-rich environment. So the Army of God is an example of this kind of organization. That's the shadowy organization that goes out and takes credit. It's not, organization is almost too grand a term, but these are the individuals who take credit for killing abortion providers. And you can see on their websites what they're trying to do. They publish the list of names of doctors, nurses, clinic personnel, the names of their children, the names of their wives, where they live, their license plate numbers, and so on. So that is how leaderless resistance functions. And if you look at how Al-Qaeda has been evolving, it has become a kind of hybrid organization. It's moving from the traditional commander cadre terrorist army to incorporate some of the leaderless resistance style. And indeed, an essay called Leaderless Resistance, which was written by Louis Beam, one of the leading intellectual lights in the racist right, that essay has been picked up by Islamist sites. What does all this mean for our response? I would really emphasize the issue of humiliation when we think about how to respond to terrorism. I should tell you that a very famous colleague of mine accuses me of having a Prozac approach to terrorism. He thinks that because I'm a woman, I hear from terrorists how humiliated they are. But actually, you don't have to read what terrorists have said to me. You can just take a look at what Zawahiri says himself. Not what he said to me, but what he says in his own writing. You can find it on the internet. Zawahiri, the second in command of Al-Qaeda. If you do a search on the term humiliation, you will see that he says that the Islamic world has been humiliated by the West. And that, again, the way to overcome that humiliation is by, both at the level of the individual and at the collective level, is through jihad. How should this feed into our policy responses? Whenever we respond with violence, and I think we sometimes have to, there's a short-term benefit but a long-term cost. And the long-term cost often has to do with humiliation and the terrorist's ability to mobilize as a result of our response. So we have to be very clear about the weighing those short-term benefits against those long-term costs. I believe that in Afghanistan, the benefits were greater than the costs. I believe that in Iraq, the benefits are essentially non-existent. I believe that from the beginning, and it's becoming more and more clear every day. And the costs are vast. It was completely predictable that our enemies would use our attacking Iraq and occupying Iraq, especially the way we did, as a mobilizing cry. And they have. Intelligence agencies around the world are talking about that. Going in there, ill-prepared to create a functioning state, we've essentially created exactly one of those risk factors that I mentioned, a weak and failing state. And indeed, that is a risk factor that has been identified by the Bush administration as a kind of breeding ground of terrorism, a weak state. Well, my goodness, Iraq is definitely a weak state. So that's one thing I think we need to bear very much in mind. When we think about military action, we need to pay a lot of attention to the possibility of using covert action and penetrating the groups and learning what those individuals are valuing. Some of them really are in it for the money. And we have benefited from that before when al-Fadl, a member of al-Qaeda, was infuriated that he earned $500 a month and the Egyptians earned $800 a month. He quit al-Qaeda. It's not, people think, oh, the 19 hijackers, they were rich. No, not everyone involved in al-Qaeda is a suicide bomber. And not everyone comes from a middle or upper middle class family. So that's something we need to learn about. We can only learn about that by penetrating the groups. These groups are competing with one another, and we need to use that against them. When you see a letter written by Zarqawi from Iraq, as published in the New York Times, I have no reason to think that it's a hoax. Some people think the U.S. government manufactured that letter. I think that's unlikely. And he's going to al-Qaeda and saying, could you please fund this operation I'm interested in? He's not the only one going to essentially the Ford Foundation of terrorist organizations and saying, could you fund my pet project? Other terrorists are doing the same thing. We need to penetrate the group so we know how they're related and how they're competing. Covert action is much more effective than overt action. Rather than arresting individuals and trumpeting our successes, again, we should use them to penetrate the groups, get inside them. And I'm quite happy to see that the FBI seems to be moving away from advertising its successes and instead toward a quieter approach and penetrating these groups. And I'm going to stop there because I know you have questions and I want to make sure I address the issues that you really want to know about.
Thank you for those very interesting and complicated insights that you provided us with. And I've been asked to start off with a question, and then we invite people to come to the microphone. Please limit yourself to questions so that we can get as many of you in tonight. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in the National Security Council and how the U.S. government has dealt with this issue of terrorism, because that's been the subject, of course, of hearings and a lot of speculation. How well prepared are we? What was the environment like when you were in the National Security Council?
I think it's important to realize that a focus on states as opposed to non-state actors is a problem that existed, as far as I'm concerned, in the Clinton administration as well. Because I have been focusing on non-state actors since graduate school, I can tell you that, it's... someone accused me of having a worm's eye view, someone I know you would know. But I have seen non-state actors as the most significant threat to international security for a long time, and I've been very frustrated for a long time that most people thought that it was, a rather eccentric thing to study. Until September 11th, I think people more or less felt sorry for me that I had such weird interests. But at the same time, it is definitely true that Dick Clark was among those who felt very strongly that terrorism was a growing threat. And by the end of the Clinton administration, the president felt very strongly that he was very aware of the terrorism problem. In fact, we might even say obsessed. I worked in Dick Clark's office. Dick Clark had the Oliver North suites at the National Security Council, so he had a lot of real estate. I wasn't working for him. I heard all about him. He was an extraordinary bureaucratic battler. I guess we all know that now. And I didn't hear very good things about him from people at his level, I have to admit. But because I was more or less a spy in his office, I learned some interesting things about Dick Clark that most people don't realize. Everyone who worked for him loved him. He treated them extremely well. Once a person has worked for Dick Clark, they work for him forever. Whenever he needs them, they will come back, wherever they are. It's amazing. When I went to the Council on Foreign Relations, I guess I'm answering the question about Dick Clark because I figure you're probably at least as interested in that. I invited him to speak, and he refused to speak to the grown-ups. He would only speak to the term members, who are the young people who join the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a very interesting man who really cares a lot about promoting young people. And, of course, his boss, Tony Lake, loved him because he was very effective. Anyway, my experience at the NSC, other than learning about Dick Clark, which has turned out to be very interesting now that he's become so important and so famous, I also did get to see, I went in as a fellow, I did get to see this tension between the FBI and the CIA, that there's, to some extent, still somewhat of a debate within political science about how important individuals are and bureaucratic bad actors, bureaucratic politics. But as soon as I got into government, it was impossible for me to believe that anyone would still debate these issues, because it was so obvious, especially if you looked at the tensions between the FBI and the CIA. I think that tension is beginning to be healed a bit, but just beginning.